Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for an Awake Security webinar titled Unmanaged Device Security, Defending IoT and the Expanding Attack Surface. My name is Rudolph Araujo, and I'm the VP of Marketing, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. We live in a world where many of our devices, applications, and users are unmanaged, especially as we move into this remote world where the lines between business and personal are blurrier than ever. How equipped are you for situational awareness into this unmanaged attack surface, to detect to it, or indeed from it, and to investigate, respond, and remediate those threats? We're joined today by David Pearson, Awake's principal threat researcher. David has been analyzing network traffic for well over a decade and has spent the majority of his professional career understanding how networks and applications work and when they don't or are compromised. David and his team have helped uncover a plethora of IoT-related threats, from compromised voice-over IP phone infrastructure to Raspberry Pi devices being used as backdoors. David is going to help shed light into his research on techniques he has developed for hunting for IoT devices and defending them. If you have questions or technical difficulties along the way, please use the Q&A and chat feature in Zoom. And without further ado, David, over to you.
Thanks, Rudy. And thanks everybody for joining here. Really looking forward to chatting about some IoT devices and unmanaged devices. Let's jump right into it. If I know how to use my mouse. So I think Rudy already covered, principal threat researcher, been with Awake for quite a while now. It's been a blast. So there's a lot of really cool things that we'll be able to talk about today. So just level setting agenda. Why do we care about IoT in 2020? Plenty of good reasons. What was the research that my team and I did, and how do we actually put that into practice? How did we do that research itself? And then, of course, what are the actual applications of that? What are the real world examples where we found all sorts of categories of problems, whether it's just understanding what the network looks like in the interesting but benign case, finding compliance risks, things that are maybe not indicative of an active attack, but could be the precursor to an attack, could be something that causes you to have risk. And then finally, compromises, things that are actually malicious that you really want people to understand and to be able to remediate. Finally, we'll talk about takeaways. What are the nuggets of information that I think are pretty important about this? And then we'll finally open it up to questions. All right, so in the last half of a decade, the number of IoT devices has clearly exploded, right? This is thinking about, we have a lot of consumer devices. There are a lot of smart devices. There are a lot of printers and scanners and voice over IP phones. All of these different things end up on organizations' networks, right? All of these things can be used for attacks, can be used to be the initial starting point, can be used to further an attack, can be used to learn information about the network, can be used as a vector to learn information about the users within the network. There's just an absolutely massive number of devices that now exist that are in this non-traditional, non-managed space. So you see this chart here, the bar chart for 2020 shows the green aspect at the very bottom is what traditional enterprise is. Very, very small number or percentage of the entire amount of devices that are in an organization. The BYOD, of course, is also a very large category. And then finally, unmanaged and IoT, specifically not devices that are owned by a user that are laptops and desktops, but rather everything else that can come along for the ride. And this is some really interesting research Palo Alto Networks has done relatively recently. So they found that in their analysis, pretty much all of the traffic that happens to or from an IoT device is unencrypted. And there's a lot of information that gets exposed. And we'll actually walk through several of these examples that we found in the real customer environments a little bit later. Another important point here is oftentimes these devices are set up and are either forgotten or they kind of end of life in place. And so there's a lot of churn in terms of, does the manufacturer actually support updating it? Does the manufacturer support making it secure if there's a vulnerability that's found and then exploited, right? So they, again, Palo Alto Networks found a lot of information showing there's a lot of systems that exist out there that have medium to high vulnerability, high severity attacks that exist on networks. And this is just another follow-up piece that actually quoted one of my colleagues, Eric Poynton, where we found some interesting behavior, and we'll actually talk about that behavior a little bit later, but just showing how the industrial infrastructure, OT devices and everything, how they really have a lot of issues that can be exploited by this. And I like to have real world examples of just observing the world. This was actually from the local airport before coronavirus hit, back when I was still allowed to travel. I think this was last August, if I remember correctly. It was the welcome back ceremony for a bunch of students. And this was at our local airport. This was a very large vertical screen. They had just done an entire renovation in the airport, spent a lot of money, and made it really user-friendly and informative. And so this very large display in the center of the airport, I noticed that there was a team viewer, which is a remote access tool that's used for plenty of legitimate purposes, but also is co-opted by malicious folks to do lots of extra special things. Anyway, I saw this alert right on the screen in the middle of the airport, and it would cycle. I think it had a 10-second or so or 20-second retry period, and then it would go off, and then it would come back on, and it would go off. So hopefully it was just somebody who forgot to set up their management correctly. Hopefully it wasn't actually somebody being malicious, but it was definitely interesting. And coronavirus, everybody on this call, everybody in the world is dealing with this. And so where we previously had this somewhat of a boundary where only devices that left your corporate network could be affected by what's going on at home, now there's a significant number of us who are actually working from home. Obviously, I'm working from home. Plenty of us are right now. And the risks associated with the devices that you have at home now matter to your organization's security posture, right? So if you have a smart home hub that's vulnerable to some exploit, and either you didn't protect it correctly or somebody got into the account, etc., that now matters to your organization's security posture. Okay, so we've talked about why. Let's actually talk about how we were able to identify these devices. So this is research that I did probably about 2 years ago at this point. And I spent a lot of time analyzing our customer networks to understand how different types of devices showed up. And we'll walk through some of the insights that I found from there. So the hypothesis that I wanted to either prove or disprove at the beginning of my research was that I could analyze the behavior from these different devices over time and figure out what devices were IoT and OT devices, which ones were mobile devices, which ones were BYOD systems, which ones were corporate infrastructure, and then finally enterprise devices. And we'll walk through what I mean by everything that I just mentioned in a second. So as I mentioned, I actually went and looked at the networks that we had access to, and continue to do this and review how that research looks as time goes on. But the 5 different groups of devices that I just mentioned, I kind of try to separate them out here. So enterprise devices, of course, are the things that are used by people within an organization, the end users, right? So they might be desktops, they might be laptops, and they're used to access services, either communicating with other devices via SMB or accessing the DNS server, the Kerberos, authentication, etc. Right? BYOD systems, what I'm referring to here, are devices that come into the network, but generally aren't used to actually perform work duties. So these might be people bring in a laptop to stream music if they can't have that on their corporate device. Maybe they have a child with them and they need to be on the guest network. Maybe you have a retail organization where you have customers who are coming in, right? They aren't actually part of your workforce, but they're still using your resources. So they might be connected to your guest network and then communicating out to the internet. Mobile devices are kind of a somewhat of a subset of that, but also special in that they really move around a lot. Whereas BYOD systems, the laptops and such of the world, they certainly move around, but they're not as prolific on average as the mobile devices, the phones and the iPods and so on. Then we have IoT and OT, right? And this is just anything that has the prefix of smart on it. All sorts of different office equipment that's connected to the internet. There's a massive amount of things that fall into this category, and that's why it's so interesting. And then finally, corporate infrastructure. These are the things that serve the services that enterprise devices use. So you might think of DNS servers, Active Directory servers. You might think of access points for your organization to be able to use services from a laptop that doesn't have an Ethernet jack, for example. Okay, so now I'm going to walk through the differences that I was able to identify among these categories. And the important point here is this is not a situation where every single device will perfectly match this, but these are pretty broad characterizations that are very applicable to the wide variety of things that fall within each of them. So the first one, of course, is enterprise devices. So these, as we already talked about, right, they're going to use corporate authentication mechanisms. You'll often be able to see Kerberos, or maybe you're using Okta if you're new. You'll see communications with your Active Directory servers, and so on and so forth. Often you'll see a lot of uniformity in their naming. So if you think about what that means, right? When you're a sysadmin, you're in IT, maybe you have a NOC or a SOC that's kind of combined, you need to be able to think about what your users are using in terms of devices and types, and also where they're located. And so we'll often see things like Mary's laptop that is in San Francisco on the 3rd floor, and we'll see all of that information within the name of the device. Or maybe we'll see Joe's desktop and he's in New York City on the 50th floor, right? There's really a lot of information that you can learn just by seeing the uniformity of names. These devices, of course, use a lot of applications. So there will be, maybe you're allowed to use music streaming services. So you see things like Spotify and Amazon Music, things like that. You'll see all of the different office suite kinds of things. If you're an office shop, you'll see database communications, etc. All of these different things you'll see within these devices. And the final point here is they'll exist for long periods of time. So that's not to say that they'll be continuously talking for that period of time, but rather if you're observing a network for, say, 3 months, right? Maybe you started setting up your infrastructure 3 months ago, and you see the devices that exist on the network. You'll generally see these things showing up relatively regularly, usually Monday to Friday within certain working hours, but of course they fall within other times. You'll see these devices showing up over and over again and be able to track that if you have this concept of a device. BYOD systems, again, there's a little bit of a blur depending on if they're using corporate authentication mechanisms. I'm referring to the ones that are separate from that. They are not using corporate authentication mechanisms. They're not trying to use services that are within your organization that are meant for privileged users. So that's one big difference that we'll see there. The naming schemes are completely different here, right? So you'll often see the name of the company or manufacturer that created the device. So you'll see a lot of Jen's MacBook Pro and Liz's Air and Joe's Surface and all sorts of things like that, because it's that you just use whatever is set up. You don't really care unless you have a predilection for a specific name. Of course, you also see things like device names, device models. So If you have some sort of, I see this a lot with, I believe, Lenovo devices. They have a very specific model number, and you'll see that over and over again across environments. So you'll see things like that showing up when you have these kinds of BYOD systems. These systems also, of course, use many applications. Again, they might be doing different things than what your corporate devices are doing, your enterprise devices, but they will in fact still be doing a lot of things. And a lot of that might be personal use. So you'll end up seeing things like personal email addresses, and that'll get pulled out of all sorts of different things. Often places where you see that are when you're subscribing to a newsletter. A lot of times that's done in an unencrypted format even today. Mobile devices, again, these are somewhat of a subset, but special because they have some prolific behaviors. Again, they're not using corporate authentication mechanisms, similar variety of naming schemes, similar in that they use many applications. You'll sometimes see personal email addresses because people do their work on, or they do their personal use kinds of things on phones just as much as they would on a laptop. But the thing that differentiates them absolutely the most is that they move around a lot. So if you think either when you were last in an office or if you're currently in an office, if you think about your office campus, right, you might have your desk, and so you'll have your phone on there, and you'll have an IP address, and maybe you'll switch IPs every once in a while, but it won't be frequent there. But then you go to lunch, and maybe you have a cafeteria, so you'll be walking across the campus going to the cafeteria. You might have 2 or 3, depending on the size of your campus, you might have 2 or 3 different IP addresses along the way. You might then later go and work with another group that's in a different building on your campus. And so again, you may have yet another IP address. And so the Brad's droid example that we have here, the lowest red box that I highlighted, this device over the course of roughly 2 months had over 150 IP addresses, right? It's just moving around all the time. And that's not surprising. We see this all the time. Okay, so corporate infrastructure, right? These are the things that serve the services. Sometimes you'll see corporate authentication mechanisms. You might have users who need to manage them remotely, need to authenticate to them that way. Other categories of devices, you might only see local authentication, so you might not see a protocol associated with it because we're looking at network traffic. These devices, even more so than the enterprise devices, you'll see these exist for very long periods of time, and often you'll see them more or less continuously talking. It's not always that case, right? But if you think about a DNS server, people are always going to be using that DNS server to look up domains, essentially. So you'll see this behavior constantly. You'll see a high volume of it, which is generally different than a user's laptop or desktop. Because these are the servers that serve the services, you will often see that they have one or few, if they're multi-homed, IP addresses. They're not going to be using DHCP because you need to know how to get to them. They can't be moving around. So you'll see one or few IP addresses, and you'll see that forever. And you'll generally see few applications because on average, people are using those servers to do whatever that server is serving, not using those servers to go browse the internet or use Spotify or whatever. And then finally, we have IoT devices, IoT and OT devices really, but they're special in that they don't match any of the profiles that we've already talked about. So that's one thing that kind of differentiates them. They just separate from those. And we'll often see that they have proprietary, which usually means unparsed protocols. And sometimes you'll see that as the only protocol or the majority of the protocol. Sometimes you'll just see that as part of the communications. And that's done for a bunch of different reasons. It could be security through obscurity, which is a common thing that we often see. It could be people just thought it was cheaper to do it that way than to go set up TLS or HTTP appropriately. Maybe they wanted to do something fancy. Maybe it was a custom application. and they thought they had a better solution than what was out in the market. So you'll see all these different things for this category of devices. The one thing that you very often see is these devices will learn their environments essentially by shouting. So if you imagine going into a room as a human and just yelling, "Hey, I'm David, what are all of your names?" And everybody responds to you. That's essentially what these devices do. And you'll see this all over the place on the network. And it's a great way to be able to understand what kinds of devices you have. You'll often see specific naming schemes. The screenshot that I have here is from a bunch of similar Apple TVs. They're all named Apple-TV-S number. That wasn't set up by somebody, that was just how they came. And so you just see them over and over again like that. You'll see that with Amazon Alexas as well. The last point that I wanted to call out more explicitly, and this screenshot shows it, is because you can think about a device, you can think about how they over time differ or are the same as other devices within your network. And so you'll be able to almost magically be able to identify, hey, these devices are similar, and that means that they're probably either the same device or doing very similar things. And so we see that a lot with these devices. If you think about, you'll see VoIP phones, they're all over the place in corporations. So you see a very large number of similar devices because they're just all doing the same thing. They're either talking to their server if they have a server, they're dialing home if they have a phone home kind of thing, or they're just sending traffic back and forth. You might also see, if you have a bunch of people who have smartwatches, you might see a bunch of Apple Watches, for example, in your environment. And that's probably not something that you bought for the employees. That's just something that they have from their lifestyle. All right, so let's dive into some of the real world examples here. So we'll start off with the ones that I call benign but interesting. And this was mostly early on in my research. I wanted to understand what are the kinds of things that we can see. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the breadth of devices that we were able to see, and we'll just go from there. There's nothing particularly security relevant to this particular part of the talk, but you could see how you could derive some security from them. So this first page, these are, and for anybody that uses the Awake platform, you'll see a montage of several versions of our software here since I've done the research. But you've got things like PlayStations that are on the network, and in this case, I don't remember if this was a corporation or what it was, but there were no similar devices, meaning that this was probably the only PlayStation there. So you wouldn't expect to see that in a university, for example. Then you've got devices. These devices were conveniently named Raspberry Pi 1 and just Raspberry Pi. So we were able to find those. And I think, if I remember correctly, this was a university environment. So it's not terribly surprising that we had Raspberry Pis. The context really matters in identifying what kind of device you have and whether it's security interesting. Top right, we've got a couple of Amazon Alexas, and we were able to figure that out from some of the characteristics that they shared, in this case, talking to AmazonAlexa.com. And then in the bottom center of the screen, these were a bunch of, if you ever go to a conference and you're as a speaker, you have the podiums that allow you to control the lights and the screen and the volume and everything. Often it's devices like these Crestron devices that allow you to do all those things at once. So we are able to find them just by their similarity and then matching some of those other things that we talked about. So this one's really interesting. This was a relatively recent discovery. So conference rooms generally act the same, right? You, as somebody who's deploying teleconference kinds of things, right, you might want to roll out the same thing to all of your conference rooms so that everybody is ready to go for the same kinds of level of fidelity, and so on and so forth. There's only one of these conference rooms that's actually really interesting, right? You can see where the value of being able to identify that these are all conference rooms and identify which one's the high value asset, right? If you want to break into and start recording one of these rooms, I would pick the CEO's conference room if I were an attacker. Okay, so now we'll get into compliance. So again, just to level set here, these are scenarios that we found where generally they are very much a surprise to the customer. So that already tells us there's a very large visibility gap here. But what we identified is sometimes these things are very, very important depending on your industry, right? You're guarded by specific policies and procedures, and in some cases laws that say that you need to take care of data a certain way. And so some of these things are much more impactful depending on if you're in financial or something like that, compared to if you're in a university, for example. But these were cases where, to our knowledge, none of these were absolutely malicious, but they were impactful to the organizations themselves. Okay, just a reminder, we earlier talked about how 98% of IoT device traffic is unencrypted. And we had a little hint about some stuff that we might talk about that's related to this. So the first one we have is these were exercise bikes. And so you can see in the screenshot here that they're all talking to updates.expresso.net. So this is an Expresso branded exercise bike. You might expect to see these in a spin class or in your gym or maybe at home. But these are the smart kinds of bikes. They're similar to Pelotons in some respect that allow you to interact with them. They usually have screens. They allow you to really get engaged. You can add your social media accounts to the account and be able to keep track of things on the internet, on the cloud, in the cloud. But here we see a whole bunch of post messages to the logupload.php to their update site. And so we were able to see directly into what kinds of information they're sharing. And it turns out they're sharing quite a bit of very useful information. This is a slightly different packet from a different piece of that network communication. But what we have here, you can see the fact that it's very heavily redacted means that there's a lot of sensitive information that's being sent. And again, this is in clear text. We don't decrypt. We don't do any of that stuff. This is all in the clear, going to the internet in this case, communicating with, in this case, Expresso's servers. So we've got location names, we've got usernames, emails, age, gender, profiles, body index, body mass index, and things like that. Really sensitive information that borderline PHI, right? There's significant information that either somebody would like to know about so that it can create a better phishing campaign against you, or that they can collect and sell to, if you want to be very paranoid, sell to your insurance company, right? There's a lot of value in being able to collect this information from somebody. And the really interesting part about this one was when we shared this with a customer, they said, no, this can't be our network. You must have somebody else's network. We don't have any of these devices. And so they went and did an investigation. And it turns out somebody had relatively recently, went and bought 2 of these bikes and put them in the basement of one of the buildings so that their users could use them, right? No harm, no foul. They're just trying to give people an outlet to get some exercise in. But apparently they didn't tell anybody, and these devices were hooked up to the network and just beaconing all that data out to the internet. So this next one is a smart TV. Smart TVs often have a lot of information that's pretty interesting. This one happened to be sending out device-specific details, details about the network itself, so that you can understand if you had compromised the site, you would be able to know who has these installed and what kinds of attacks that could send against specific environments. And then of course, access details. Why don't we just give the attacker the right to get in? This next one was pretty interesting. So we were able to identify it as an Amazon Fire TV cube, and we kind of learned that from the fingerprint at the top that's in the red box there. So we were able to see the request user agent. Again, it was unencrypted for this device. But the really interesting part was it was doing enumeration of the entire network. And so that vertical red box that you see in the center of the screen is essentially showing this is the only device that has talked to, in this case, I have 5, but there were actually 20 or 30 that are cut off of the screenshot. This is the only device that is talking to all of those different systems. They're all internal on weird ports on average here, but this is the only one that's talking to all of them. So then we see, digging into the data a little bit more, this is actually what those communications look like. The red boxes were highlighting that they're getting data about what those systems are. And then we actually see this is what some of that data looked like, right? So again, redacted because we don't want to specifically identify the information, but the bottom left here, we have, this is an Axis video camera. So you'll often see these as security cameras that are placed all over the place. They're usually network connected. Clearly it was this time. So this Fire TV cube was enumerating and getting information back from this Axis camera. So really, there's no good reason for that to be happening on your network. The top right example here was again, this Fire TV cube talking to a Roku TV. So I guess they were talking about TV channels or something, but yeah, they're just collecting other information that they really don't have any reason to be collecting. And then finally, so they enumerated a bunch of devices. And again, there were more than 20 or 30 devices that were only reached out by this one, and then a handful that were also reached out to by other devices in the network. The second thing, or sorry, the last thing that they did was they were reporting this information to another internal server. So they collected all this information and then sent it somewhere else, and also got back other information from that server about other things. So you can see here, we've got MAC addresses, we've got serial numbers of devices, we've got the names of them, and so on and so forth. So it's, if I were an attacker, I would definitely want to get onto one of these boxes because it has so much information about the network. And so there are a few more that I just wanted to share. These I didn't have screenshots for because they had happened a while back, but they're pretty interesting. So this first one, it was a smart beverage system. It was phoning home, again, in plain text with the Wi-Fi info. So if they're sending the information over the internet in plain text, it's very unlikely that they're then going to encrypt it when it's at rest. But if I were trying to attack somebody, that's how I would get in. I would attack the vendor. The HVAC system, this was really interesting. So we saw an HVAC system that was being managed via RDP, and it was being managed remotely by the third-party vendor. So apparently this organization punched a hole in their firewall specifically for that vendor to manage this device via RDP. Just insane amounts of risk right there. And the last one, this blew my mind and the customer's mind when we found this. So we had dozens of remote ATMs scattered all over the country, I believe in this case. They were all communicating their location and customer transaction data, again, across the internet in plain text. So you can imagine the kinds of problems that would cause them. All right, so now the ones that everybody's been waiting for, the malicious examples. So just to explain what I mean here, so these are either things that we confirmed were malicious with customers, or when we found these, there was no way that we wouldn't report these because it had every hallmark of being malicious. And if you were internal to this organization and had found this, you would also be really surprised and want to figure out what the root cause was here. So the first one was a BeagleBone, and BeagleBone is very similar to a Raspberry Pi system on a chip, very lightweight, very easy to hide, also extremely powerful. So this BeagleBone was on a utility company's network. It was the only one on the network, which throws up a red flag. Also, it's a utility company. Why does it have a BeagleBone on the network? It, at the time, was only on the network for 5 or 6 days. And it was enumerating the network, learning about other shares that existed and other devices that existed, and then finally accessible via SSH. That was kind of the key there. So really surprising finding, and they were also surprised. The next one, so we talked a little bit about the access cameras a little bit earlier in having been enumerated by that Fire TV cube. In this case, so the access cameras are one of the devices that gets picked on, right? They're the Microsoft of 2020, and that Microsoft always got picked on for all the vulnerabilities that they had. So these devices are just riddled with problems and often don't get patched for the reasons that we already talked about. So you'll see a lot of scanning for them, and of course you'll see a lot of vulnerability scanners doing that, but it's very interesting when it's not a vulnerability scanner doing this scanning. So this was an internal system that was scanning this that had absolutely nothing to do with the sanctioned scanners that existed within this organization's network. And it was just trying to hit the cameras over and over again. This next one was pretty interesting. So we found this relatively recently. So this was a Raspberry Pi that we found inside a financial company. And so you can see that top right screenshot there. We have the threats category. So you can see this was something that our adversarial modeling automatically said, hey, by the way, this is something interesting. There's only one device in the entire network doing it, and it's an IoT device using TeamViewer. So we dug into this a little bit more and found out, okay, it's actually a Raspberry Pi. We can confirm that. And from there, we identified, oh, hey, it's actually doing tunneling pretty regularly out to TeamViewer servers, which is how TeamViewer kind of works. There's a lot of cool stuff related to that that's outside of the scope of here. But this was something that was really interesting, and again, was a real surprise to the customer once we pointed it out to them. Next one that I wanted to talk about. So the grid in general, right, is a great high value target. And there have been stories for years about different things that you can do to attack it, and that there has been espionage, or not espionage, but reconnaissance and all sorts of different things going on the grid, right? So we were able to actually identify some behavior that had all the hallmarks of that going on. So this was a water controller device that existed within a municipality, a utility company within a municipality that served about 100,000 people. So this was a remote access tool that was written by a Russian company or Russian people. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's a really powerful remote access tool. So there's quite the gamut of different things, and there's TeamViewer and AMI admin and all these different logme and stuff that's often used by, in some cases by malicious actors, but often by legitimate people trying to do their jobs. This was a special one in that it's not a very common one that we're aware of, and it also has really, really powerful capabilities. So if you look at that little insert there where we show the specific kinds of things that you can do, the one that I thought was most interesting was the very bottom one, which is connect through host. So this device can essentially act as a jump box for the rest of your network and allow you to move laterally however you please. Really, really powerful things were going on there. So in this case, you can see the screenshot that this connection was almost 90 minutes long, and there was a significant amount of data being sent from inside to the outside. And then we looked at the device over time, and we saw, oh, hey, yeah, this is continuously happening, right? There's data going out multiple times a day in some cases, sometimes just once a day, and being sent out to the servers that they control. Just a really, really interesting thing to discover on on a utility network. And so once they remediated that and took care of that problem, this was the same utility company months later that we had yet another case of this same remote access tool on another IoT device. In this case, it was a smart board. So something that you might expect to see showing you the lunch, or maybe days since last security incident, or maybe reporting status of a whole bunch of different things, right? And it was being managed, presumably, but possibly maliciously, right, via these remote utility, the Russian remote access tool, and also at the same time TeamViewer. So the fact that I had both of these things on there, it's just odd. And you can see in the screenshot here that we have the username is SCADA2. So if I saw all those things together, that would really alert me to this being interesting. And one final note on this slide is the box showing TeamViewer and remoteutilities.com. You can see that TeamViewer is used somewhat in the network, right? There's a handful of devices that use that, but what you can see is there's only one device doing this remoteutilities.com in the last week when this was taken. So that means the other device that we had reported on earlier was remediated, that wasn't a problem anymore, but somehow this device also had that behavior going on. And this was a little bit of an example here showing some of that tunneling behavior out to TeamViewer in this case from again, that device. It was about an hour long. All right, so takeaways from this. First one, everything that I described here today is only made possible by being able to think about a device over time, right? If you have an IP address, right, it's not going to let, if you have a device that has an IP address and it's moving around constantly, or even if it's not moving around constantly, but just moving around over time, you can't track anything about that device, really. You can't, if you don't have the concept of a device, you can't really think about how the device is similar to other devices, right? You really need to have this concept of what a device is from the same way that a human would think about it, right? To be able to say, this is actually interesting in this environment versus, hey, this is just another person in our university environment doing something uninteresting. Behavioral analysis is also really important. So we talked about the HVAC system that was accessible from the internet through a firewall rule via RDP. Anytime you expose something to the internet, it's essentially compromised. You need to be very careful. You can have these rules which they had in place for this, right? I made sure that I couldn't reach it at the time. So it's important to be able to have these rules in place so that you can't just be completely exposed. But it's really a big risk. And even in the case where you have these rules set up, right? You can imagine if I'm an attacker and I compromise the third-party vendor, right? Now I have the ability to jump into this environment, and if this was a process that was set up by the vendor, it's likely that they're doing something similar in other environments. So the third-party vendor risk aspect here is pretty important. Also internally, if you think about the intra-network communications, what kinds of things are you allowing to happen across your different boundaries, right? Do you have a guest network versus a production network versus a high value assets network, right? Are you allowing things to communicate across those networks? And if you are, what kind of information is being sent? And then finally, information that's being sent or received externally. So thinking back to the communications to the espresso bikes that were going out to the internet, what kind of information are you allowing to cross your boundary? Think about the ATMs, right? What information is going potentially in plain text across your boundary to other devices? That's potentially a very large risk to you, depending on what your organization's rules are. And finally, segmentation. It's really important, going back to the intra-network communications, it's really important to reduce the scope of attacks by keeping these devices separate, because if they're allowed to talk to essentially anything, it's a great way for an attacker to bypass a lot of your other controls. All right, so with that, we can open it up to questions, Rudy.
Excellent, thanks, David. Folks, if you've got any questions, definitely put them into the Q&A section, and I know David will be happy to answer them. So, David, we've got a few questions that came in. Firstly, how does encryption play into this, right? Aren't most of these devices communicating over encrypted channels? Can you really perform network analysis? So what are your insights or experiences been, David?
Yeah, so we'll first talk about IoT devices specifically. So you can remember back earlier that 98% of the communications are in the clear. So to start off with, for this particular case, generally speaking, there's a lot of data that's just in the clear. So that is one note to take from this. But of course, lots of things are encrypted, and presumably over time, IoT devices will also start to encrypt their data. Right, so there's a lot of things that you can do with encrypted data. You don't need to have decrypted data to do pretty serious analysis. So you to go from a very high level, and we can work down, if you have things like the concept of whether data is going in or out of a device, right? Are they uploading data? Are they downloading data? Is there actually some indication that there's a tunnel, right? If you're tracking how long that session has existed. And then you can get into much more detail. So you have things like from the open source side, you have JA3, and I think Cisco has Joy, which are encrypted traffic analysis platforms. And they definitely have pros and cons associated with them. If I remember correctly, Cisco's Joy is meant to improve upon JA3 by taking a different approach. And so that gives you a little bit more information about what's going on. And internally to Awake, we have a couple of subject matter experts who are also working on even more advanced capabilities. And some of the things that we're able to do are to improve upon some of the problems that JA3 has. And we're able to actually identify all the way down to specific applications that are doing behavior, even if it's encrypted, just by analyzing the TLS traffic in this case. And that's 1.2, that's 1.3, that's back farther than that as well.
Yeah, and just as a sneak peek, we actually have a couple of webinars on encrypted traffic analysis that'll be happening next month. So we can get into a lot more detail about it. I think, David, like you said, context is everything, right? Knowing that it's a browser going to Twitter is very different than seeing an IoT device going to Twitter. I don't know if IoT devices are tweeting yet, but so I think to your point, the application visibility definitely helps. Next question, David. You talked about device knowledge being important as one of your key takeaways. How do you successfully follow these devices during any investigation? In this particular attendee says, we have a highly DHCP environment and IPs change all the time, so we struggle with keeping our analysis straight. Any tips or tricks here?
Well, I mean, I could be crass and say buy Awake, right? We do this for you, right? So it's a pretty important aspect of it to be able to track that device over time. But if you have high DHCP, right, there are other signals that exist within devices that you can use to identify things. And I won't go into too much detail here, but I think the point is there are a lot of things that happen internally that allow you to be able to track that this is actually the same device over time. And of course, there's also this concept that we use at Awake, and I'll describe it at a high level, but I hope that you can kind of see where I'm going with it. So every device, so imagine if you had to fingerprint me, for example, you could say, oh, he's a guy, he's wearing a purple shirt, he's got not small ears, whatever the case, right? You can see things that are characteristic of me, and you can say, oh, all right, now I can go identify David in a crowd because I see what's interesting about him, what's notable for him. You can do the same thing with devices themselves. And so you're able to see things that are notable or fingerprintable about a device. And it's not necessarily at like a session level, but it's actually broader than that, right? You can see different kinds of applications that are being used. You can see different types of communications to different sites and so on and so forth, and the behavior that's happening there. You can use this concept of similarity, right? You can really use a lot of these additional things that are essentially learned by being able to think about things at a device level, so you can accumulate things over time, and you're able to track these things as they move around the network, sometimes with hundreds of IPs over a couple of month period.
Thanks, David. So next question kind of gets to the other end of the spectrum, right? So if you do find one of these devices that is breached, what do you see as the best practices? Are there standards out there for incident response with IoT? It feels like many of the existing IR and forensics tools can't really deal with these, in quotes, new age devices.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. So if you think about it, right, it's great when you have a managed environment where you can drop a tool on the system, or maybe you already have an endpoint agent on that system. You know exactly where it is, and so on and so forth, and you can go ahead and get back whatever data you need through whatever acquisition capability you have. That's not necessarily true, and often not true, especially in malicious cases or insider cases. You don't necessarily know if you actually can find the device in some cases, in the case of maybe Raspberry Pis, for example. So it's essentially out of the window wholesale to be able to drop something on the device in terms of an endpoint agent. Also, a lot of these tools, as you point out, don't really have an endpoint agent kind of thing, or can possibly have one for some of these devices, right? And the variety of these devices, of course, makes that even harder. So it really comes back to, how do you think about the problem differently? And so at Awake, the way we think about the problem is, if you actually can track this device across the network and understand to whom it has contacted, right? So who internally has it communicated with, who has communicated with it, right? So that tells you scope of possible infection if it's a compromised device, right? And you're able to see that over time. You're able to see, going back to if it's being able to track it as a device versus an IP, if it's moving around to different locations and you have just the IP address for some time, you need to go figure out, maybe with your NOC, who actually had this IP at the right time. So there's a lot of benefits to being able to see things from the network side and track them in that respect.
It's a little bit like the old days of tracking down the rogue access points, I guess.
Yeah. You can go around with a physical radar gun, essentially.
All right. So I think that's all the questions we have, folks. If you think of any other questions after the webinar is done, definitely send those to us, and we'll get David to kind of jump in and give you some insights. Thanks everyone for attending today. If you would like to share or view the recording, these are always available on Awake's YouTube channel. You could also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter for more of our insights. We look forward to seeing you on the next Awake Security webinar.